Before I start my sermon around the title Disruption, I also want to address two items. The first is the beautiful banners you can see behind me. Those were made by Irina Kinzel Guerra, who is now residing in South Carolina, but with us in the service. Thank you again, Irina. Glad we can still enjoy your legacy among us here. And the other item, I was thinking while Larry was talking about the gifts that we bring forward. I want to thank the congregation for their faithfulness with the honoring of their pledges and even additional giving in these days. Thank you so much for being so faithful and supporting the work of the church in a wonderful way. We appreciate it. We are grateful that we can continue with the work. It's so well supported by you and many other people benefiting from it, especially through our missions. We're also grateful. The sermon title, Disruption, as I've said, and I'll speak against the backdrop of the two scripture passages, Genesis 11 and Acts chapter 2. Disruption these days, and for the last, I would say, about 2.5 decades, is a popular word in the business circles, especially in Silicon Valley circles. It was formulated, the concept of disruption or disruptive innovation, by Professor Clayton Christensen from Harvard Business School, where all things good emanates from, or all things bad emanates from, depending on where you stand and how you look at things. So disruptive innovation. And it simply means, and if I don't do the term justice, those with the necessary qualification and information and experience can correct me, but it simply means that with the right kind of innovation, a dominant market position of a product or a service can be disrupted or upended by a new startup especially, or a competitor who offers a better or a less expensive solution and a product or a service, and then overtakes the established market leader or market leaders through that. There has been some discontent with the degree to which that theory is true. And for instance, Professor Ian Bogost of Georgia Tech recently said, it seems that the majority of situations where this occurs, it's more about just disruption, which is destructive. And it is not disruption that is innovative in the sense that it replaces what exists with something better or with something that's really improving on what was in existence. So there is a bit of questioning whether this disruption and disruptive innovation is really taking place. Most often, seemingly just to destroy what is so that you can offer something similar. But that with the difference that it's this time your product and you are now the new establishment. This term has also become popular in political circles, not only here, but worldwide, where disruption is seen as the replacement of the established and the accepted political order or philosophy that has dominated the globe since World War II, liberal democracy and a specific form of capitalism. And it is practiced today, or is embraced today, by a number of political parties and movements across the globe. It seems that most often, as in the business environment, the disruption is aimed at or results in destruction and not necessarily constructive innovation. But that's a debate for another time. We also read in these two passages this narrative, the story about the Tower of Babel, and also the story about Pentecost, about disruption. Let's first look at the story of Babel. It is a story like, for instance, the story of the Great Flood. The narrative of the story of the Tower of Babel also has equivalents in other cultures and literature of those cultures. There is even a story from Africa around that. There's a story in the Nepalese culture. But the most clear equivalent, or that we can identify as probably originating from the same source, is that from the Akkadian Sumerian cultures. There are two stories. The first story is that of Enkhenmar and Lord Aratta, where there is a prayer, for Enkhenmar is the builder of this very high tower. And at some stage there is a prayer offered, an appeal made to the god Enki. Say, please, these people that are building the tower speak different languages. Can you suspend that? Let them all speak the same language so that we can proceed in easier fashion with the work. There's also another story in the Sumerian culture, Etemenanki, which means the foundation of the temple of heaven and earth. This was the name, Etemenanki, of a ziggurat, or a big construction project where you have these huge mounds, somewhat similar to a pyramid on different levels. And this ziggurat of Etemenanki was dedicated to the Sumerian god of Marduk. Interesting in all these stories there, and also in the biblical story, that was probably based on those Sumerian stories and the Akkadian stories, and that the Israelites encountered when they were in exile in Babylon. But central to the biblical story is fear. Fear by the God of that features in that story, that is afraid that people will enter into heaven, so to speak, will gain possibilities and abilities to this tower, moving from the level of the humans up to the next story in their universe, as it was perceived then. The top story was the story of the gods, the level of the gods. There's that fear present, and then also fear of the people that there won't be a legacy, that they won't have any legacy if they do not congregate in the same place, embrace their one culture that they have, and do not move and disperse around the earth. So they, so to speak, circle the wagons. Let's congregate here, build this city with this tower. In the New Testament, the story of Pentecost, or let me first say then, then there's this disruption. Disruption because of the confusion of languages, of the one language, and they spoke several languages. They are dispersed across the earth. Their fear became a reality. Then we get to the Pentecost story in the New Testament. A wonderful story about a specific Passover that we refer in the Christian tradition as Easter now. It was customary for the Jewish people that lived in the Roman Empire, dispersed throughout that empire in different countries and provinces, speaking different languages, like Larry read for us, to go to Jerusalem for the pilgrimage around Passover. And then many of them would stay on for another 50 days because the festival of Pentecost would follow. 50 days after Passover, they would celebrate Pentecost. So many of the pilgrims went to Jerusalem for Passover, stayed the 50 days, celebrate Pentecost, and then went home. Now, on this specific Pentecost, it was more or less business as usual in that corner of the Roman Empire. It was Passover, a time when the Jewish people would celebrate their liberation from the oppression in Egypt. And it was a highly emotional time because they were dominated and oppressed by the Romans now. So every Easter or every Passover, there would be protests. There would be what we would call today riots. And there would be the usual crucifixion, especially with Pontius Pilate. That was his specialty, brutal crowd control to the terror of crucifixion. So this Passover, it was the same thing. A few crucifixions, because there was a disturbance in the temple, and the usual business of the people around that person who was crucified hiding, fearing for their lives, running away, being scattered, because you do not want to be associated with that person that was crucified. You were fearing for your life, either to be just killed outright or to be shipped off to be an oarsman, a rower in one of the battleships, which didn't guarantee you a long lifespan, or being shipped off to one of the mines, which had the same result. You would have a short life. You would die very soon after commencing your duties as a slave there. So business as usual, and we find the disciples hiding from the Romans, perhaps probably also from some Jewish people who did not like what they were doing and what Jesus was saying. And then the story of these unusual events, a disruption of the normal flow of events, the regular Passover events, of the sound of a powerful wind, the tongues of flames positioning themselves on the head of people, and then the people speaking in languages, those languages of all the pilgrims gathered from all across the Roman Empire for this festival of Pentecost. There was a disruption again. Not a destruction this time, but a disruption of the regular flow of the Passover events. Today we find ourselves also in disrupted time. disrupted like seldom before. At least more than 100 years ago was the last time that a pandemic caused global disruption on this scale. But on top of that, we have another disruption. The disruption that around the event in Minneapolis. The effect of the disruption of the pandemic is not yet clear. We are beginning to experience, or we have experienced for a few months, what it is like to live in different phases and stages, and to a certain extent, different extents, in lockdown or isolation. I don't think we've really experienced the economic and financial impact of that pandemic. We've seen the disruption and the effect of what happened in Minneapolis emerging very quickly, very clearly, and brutally. What happened there is absolutely tragic. Tragic that an unarmed man would be killed in that way, begging to breathe. It's tragic. And what's perhaps even more tragic is that it's the tip of the iceberg. What is also tragic is, in response to that the good image of, or let me say, what's also tragic, not in response to that, but just looking at that incident, is that the good work and the image of many good police officers across this nation, in so many precincts, so many cities and towns, have been tarnished by that. People that really work faithfully, compassionately, day after day, month after month, year after year, and do excellent work. It is time that, especially around this Pentecost time, that this natural flow of events gets disrupted. I want to quote the mayor of Washington, D.C., Mayor Muriel Bowser. She said, "People are tired, sad, angry, and desperate for change. Amid America's continuing racism," she said, "we need leaders who recognize this pain, and in times of great turmoil and despair, can provide us a sense of calm and a sense of hope." My hope and my prayer is that in this time, this disruption of both the pandemic, the disruption of the death in Minneapolis, that it will kindle and fan flames of the courage, of awareness of the depth of the pain and the wrongs and the inequities and inequalities that have been brought perhaps more clearly into the light through the pandemic, that we may muster the courage, and I hope it will burn like a flame and a devouring fire in us to find our voice, so that like the flames that placed themselves on the heads of the people gathered in that narrative of the Pentecost, that we may find our voice, and even though we may speak different languages and find ourselves in different places, that we may unite and speak one language, a united voice of wisdom and of healing and of compassion, so that justice may be done. And like that first Pentecost, that a powerful wind may sweep through us and through us into the world, so that powerful winds of change may bring clarity, like we've seen when there are no carbon energy-based vehicles on the roads, in so many cities where we can see landmarks for the first time in decades. May there, from all of us, in these moments of pain and sadness, of anxiety and despair about what we observe around us as a result of that death, may there be passionate and committed action, action inspired by the dream of God's world. And may the only fear that we experience be the fear that we cannot muster the courage to heed the call, to stand up and be heard, and to act, to keep the prophetic imagination alive, that bridge between what is and what should be in the world of God. And let us also, as part of our calling, assume the responsibility to embrace and to work for reconciliation, but reconciliation not on the grave of truth. Reconciliation not on the back of the blood of the innocents. Reconciliation not based on the sweat of those that worked like slaves. And reconciliation not based on the humiliation of the poor. And so often where people are thrown away, ignored, as if they are nothing. I've pleaded with you for years for the realization that in any system, when there is an imbalance, nature teaches us, and we see it in society as well. When there is an imbalance, the system corrects it. And it can even happen violently, or it can happen in a measured way. The disruption can either be destructive, or it can be innovative and produce something better. And my hope this Pentecost is that we will be adequate for the task to rekindle the prophetic imagination, to embrace the change that is necessary, and that us, Congregational Church of Topsfield, embrace those and lock arms with those that share the dream that Jesus had, and the dream that Martin Luther King also kept alive. May the disruption that we experience not be only destruction, but may it be a disruption through which we build something better, the world according to God, so that we may again live in hope, so that despair may not be the main part of the American diet. May God's Spirit on this Pentecost lead us to that realization, inspire us to that courage, and help us to be God's people of hope. Amen.